Steve Case, welcome. It's good to talk to you here at Economy. You've been spending a lot of your time on some policy initiatives to try and get America working again. Talk about a few of the things that you're doing along this.
Well, I think it's important, which is why I'm spending time on it. We have a high unemployment rate, 9%, have a low growth rate, 2%, and the way to get the economy moving and the job creation engine moving again is to focus particularly on entrepreneurship. If you look at the data from the Kauffman Foundation, it does a good job of tracking this. All the net jobs of the last 3 decades, 40 million jobs, have come from high growth entrepreneurial companies that are growing 20% a year, so they essentially are doubling in size over 4 years, and young companies under 5 years. So that's the place to focus if you really want to get public policy supportive of job creation and the economy. You've got to really double down on entrepreneurship.
So what would be the 3 policies, if you could decree them, that could get America working? If you could just cut through the red tape and do 3 things to get America back?
Well, there are actually some things the administration can do on its own. We've recommended a list. Some things the private sector needs to do. And there's 3 particular areas that we said Congress needs to act on. One relates to immigration, one relates to access to capital, and one relates to regulation. On immigration, we know immigration reform is a very complicated, sensitive, emotional issue, but we're really losing the global battle for talent, particularly around high-skilled engineers and entrepreneurs. We actually have done a good job of getting people to our country to give them PhDs, but then we kick them out and force them to start companies in other countries that compete with us, and it's crazy. So we've recommended things like stapling a green card to those PhDs and encouraging people to stay. So immigration is a key piece.
We're also, they're key employees at growing startups that then spin out other companies too. It's not even that they would just start companies out of college, but presumably these are people we should help become American.
Absolutely, and the data suggests they're job makers, not job takers. And so that's it. When you talk about immigration, everybody's worried about people taking jobs. These are people who are making jobs, creating companies that can scale rapidly. About 40% of Silicon Valley companies are founded by immigrants.
In your comments earlier on stage at the conference, I think you mentioned something about, I thought was sort of a shocking number, about the decline in new enterprise creation over the last 5 years. And I think it was 23%.
The number of startups is down 23% over the last 5 years.
That's actually, so from someone from a who's coming from the Silicon Valley perspective, that's a shocking number.
Yeah,
so what's happening there? Why is that?
Well, it's a little bit of the tale of 2 cities. Silicon Valley is actually doing well. If you're a social media company, you probably don't have too much trouble with talent, or too much trouble with capital, or too much trouble with regulation. But if you look around the nation, a lot of high growth, most high growth companies are not technology companies, and they're not in Silicon Valley. They're spread all over the nation, and they're in services and manufacturing and other sectors, and that's where it's become more challenging. And going back to the 3 things I mentioned, immigration. The other 2 I think are directly related to what's happening around the country. One is access to capital, and we really are looking at ways to allow crowdfunding of companies, so you can aggregate lots of small amounts from a lot of people to help fund the early stage. We've recommended that the capital gains be eliminated if you have an investment and hold it for 5 years in a young high growth company. If you buy stock in an IPO in the first 6 months after a company goes public and keep it for 3 years, so you're really encouraging kind of a buy and hold strategy, and then capital gains would be cut to 10%. So there's things related to capital formation and incentives around capital that we think can unleash more capital flowing to these high growth companies. And the third piece relates to regulation. And there's some sectors that need attention, particularly around healthcare. The FDA is doing some things with trying to keep people safe, which is understandable, that essentially makes it more costly to develop drugs and devices in this country, so more of that development and testing is moving offshore. We're at the risk of losing a whole industry there. So there's some specific regulatory interventions necessary there, but one that really applies to all entrepreneurial companies relates to IPOs. Sarbanes-Oxley was put in place to try to make sure there's transparency around public companies, which I think is understandable and probably was necessary, but it's not appropriate to have the same Sarbanes-Oxley rules that apply to giant companies like GE and IBM apply to these small high growth companies. We need to make sure more companies have access to the public markets, because for 2 reasons. One is 90% of jobs are created after companies go public, not before. And the second is, if companies don't have a path to go public, often investors are looking for liquidity and the companies are sold. And when companies are sold, job growth usually decelerates. When companies go public, it accelerates. So we've got to figure out ways to encourage more of these young, high growth companies to go public. When AOL went public almost 20 years ago, as the first internet company to go public, we raised $15 million at a market cap of $70 million, and then grew rapidly, and obviously went from 100 employees to 10,000 employees.
You can't even do it now.
That doesn't really work today, and
right.
we need to make access to the public markets a little easier for these entrepreneurs.
But the kind of employees all these companies tend to hire, you're talking about a lot of solutions for high growth companies, a lot of smart, highly skilled workers. What do we do about the crisis among lower skilled workers? I mean, that's where the true jobs crisis is in this country, and how much of these ideas, I mean, what can we do to spur that? Because until we move that needle, it's going to be very hard to get GDP up.
That's fair, but I'd answer it in two ways. There are some sectors of the economy that could unleash enormous economic growth and job creation. Education and healthcare are two, that so far have not seen the same level of disruptive innovation that we've seen in entertainment or other financial service, other parts. And some of that is structural, because healthcare, the decisions are not made by consumers, they're made by payers, either companies or governments or insurance companies or what have you. And education, essentially the way most people are taught, it's a highly structured system. It's hard to, again, to break in. So, and those are huge job creators, and the healthcare alone is almost 20% of our economy. So if we can create more innovation around those things, I think would be helpful. But also, there are also internet companies that help create jobs. One of the companies I've been involved in as an early investor is Living Social. They've gone from 4 people 4 years ago to 4,000 people today, but just as importantly, probably more importantly, they're really enabling Main Street small businesses to compete, whether it be a restaurant or a spa, driving traffic and awareness to those, and those create jobs as well. So there's some direct effects, and there's also some indirect effects.